When I first inherited the cabin from my grandfather, I thought I'd found my perfect escape. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by towering pines and rugged cliffs, it was the kind of place most people only dreamed of. 20 acres of private land, a small but sturdy log cabin built in the 1950s, a quiet creek that meandered through the woods. This was my sanctuary. After years of working as an engineer in the chaos of city life, I craved silence. And here, silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a living, breathing presence. I pulled my truck up the narrow gravel path, tires crunching over rocks as the cabin came into view, its dark timber walls almost blending into the forest behind it. The familiar sight brought a sense of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. I parked near the porch, stepped out, and inhaled deeply. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, fresh in a way no urban park could ever replicate. I grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat and climbed the creaky wooden steps, unlocking the front door with the brass key I kept on an old leather cord around my neck. Inside, the cabin was just as I'd left it. Framed black and white photos of my grandfather on the walls, his old hunting rifle mounted above the stone fireplace, a stack of dog-eared paperbacks next to the rocking chair. I set down my bag and lit a fire, watching as the flames curled around the logs. Outside, dusk settled over the mountains, shadows stretching long and thin across the clearing. It felt good to be back. The next morning, I woke early, sunlight filtering through the plaid curtains. I brewed a pot of strong coffee and stepped onto the porch, cup warming my hands as I gazed out over the forest. Everything seemed untouched, serene. But when I walked down the dirt path toward the main gate, an old iron gate my grandfather had installed decades ago, I noticed something that didn't belong. Hanging from the latch was a clear plastic sleeve, the kind used for official notices. Inside was a neatly folded letter printed on heavy stock paper. I frowned, pulled it out, and unfolded it. As I read, my stomach twisted. "Dear property owner," it began in bold letters, "we are pleased to inform you that, following the recent boundary expansion of the Pine Valley Estates Homeowners Association, your property is now part of our community. Please be advised of the following obligations: immediate payment of a $12,000 initiation fee, enrollment in Pine Valley Estates, HOA, provision of keys to all gates and dwellings for routine inspections, compliance with community regulations, including prohibitions on tree cutting, open fires, and fishing." I stared at the letter in disbelief. Was this a joke? I wasn't part of any homeowners association. This land had been in my family since 1958, long before Pine Valley Estates ever existed. I flipped the letter over, looking for some explanation, but there was none, just a signature from someone named Claire Mills, president. A slow anger bubbled beneath my confusion. I crumpled the letter, stuffed it back into the sleeve, and tossed it into the truck bed. "Yeah, right," I muttered under my breath. "Not a chance." I latched the gate shut behind me and walked back toward the cabin, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Whoever sent that letter clearly didn't understand whose land they were messing with. But something told me this wasn't the last I'd hear of it. I thought the letter was an empty threat, a bureaucratic mistake that would disappear as quickly as it had arrived. But 2 days later, I learned just how wrong I was. I was standing by the creek that morning, tossing pebbles into the water, when the distant hum of an engine floated through the trees. I turned toward the sound, narrowing my eyes as dust kicked up along the gravel road. A sleek black SUV crept around the bend, its shiny paint completely out of place against the rugged mountain backdrop. The SUV rolled to a stop just outside my gate, tires crunching on loose stone. 3 figures stepped out. Leading them was a woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a tailored navy blazer and crisp khakis, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun. Behind her stood two bulky men in matching polo shirts embroidered with Pine Valley HOA in gold lettering. Their arms were crossed, their expressions unreadable behind dark sunglasses. The woman strode toward the gate with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "Good morning," she called, her voice clipped and authoritative. "I'm Claire Mills, president of the Pine Valley Estates Homeowners Association. And you must be Mr. Cameron." I stayed where I was, hands resting on the fence post. "That's right," I replied evenly. "What can I do for you?" Claire smiled thinly, pulling a clipboard from under her arm. "We're here to complete our inspection. We'll need access to your cabin and property. Please open the gate and provide any keys." I raised an eyebrow. "Inspection? For what?" "For compliance," she said, as if it were obvious. "Your property is now under the jurisdiction of Pine Valley Estates. We sent you a letter outlining the requirements. We're here to ensure those requirements are being met." I shook my head slowly. "I got your letter, and I threw it away. This land isn't part of Pine Valley. It's been privately owned by my family since 1958. You have no jurisdiction here." Claire's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. "Mr. Cameron, our legal team has reviewed the expansion boundaries. Your property falls within them. I suggest you cooperate before this becomes a legal matter." "Already is," I shot back, "because you're trespassing, and unless you have a court order, you're not setting foot past that gate." One of the men stepped forward, his chest puffed slightly. "You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be, sir." I met his stare without blinking. "I'm not making it hard. I'm enforcing the law. This is private property." Claire sighed dramatically, flipping a page on her clipboard. "Mr. Cameron, I'm trying to be reasonable here, but if you refuse access, we'll have no choice but to escalate. The HOA has the right to enforce community standards. We can involve law enforcement if necessary." I leaned over the gate just slightly. "Go ahead," I said quietly. "Call whoever you want, but you're not getting in." For a long moment, Claire just stared at me, lips pressed into a tight line. Then she stepped back and motioned to her companions. "Let's go," she snapped. "We're not finished here, Mr. Cameron. Next time, we won't ask so nicely." They climbed back into the SUV, doors slamming with synchronized finality. As the engine roared to life and they disappeared down the winding road, I felt a strange mix of anger and dread settle in my chest. I'd stood my ground, but their parting words echoed ominously in the quiet air. I watched until the dust trail faded beyond the trees, then turned back toward the cabin, my jaw clenched tight. I knew I hadn't seen the last of Claire Mills, and next time, I suspected she wouldn't come alone. I didn't hear from Claire for a few days after her visit, and for a brief, foolish moment, I thought maybe she'd realized how absurd her claims were. Maybe she'd gone back to her HOA board, admitted defeat, and dropped the whole thing. But deep down, I knew better. People like Claire didn't back down. They regrouped, strategized, and came back swinging. It was late afternoon when I heard the sound of engines again. I was inside the cabin, finishing up a batch of repairs on one of the window frames, when the low rumble of approaching vehicles broke the peaceful quiet. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped onto the porch, squinting toward the gate. This time, it wasn't Claire's black SUV. It was 3 police cruisers. My heart sank. I set down the rag and walked toward the gate as the cars rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust. The doors opened, and 3 uniformed officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts, expressions neutral but firm. "Mr. Cameron?" the lead officer called. "Yeah," I answered cautiously. "That's me." He nodded and approached. We received a 911 call reporting illegal occupation of this property. The caller claimed you're trespassing on land that belongs to Pine Valley Estates. We need to see identification and proof of ownership. I let out a dry laugh, shaking my head. Of course she did. I motioned toward the porch. I've got the paperwork inside. Give me a second. They waited as I retrieved the file folder I kept with me every visit. The original deed from 1958, the survey maps, the property tax receipts, the official county records. I handed the documents to the officer, who leafed through them carefully, his brow furrowing in concentration. "This all looks legitimate," he said after a moment. "I'll radio the office to confirm the parcel number, but I don't see anything here that suggests you're on anyone else's land." "Because I'm not," I replied. "This is private property. Been in my family for over 60 years. Another officer, younger and more impatient, glanced toward the road. "She said you were threatening the HOA board, making aggressive statements. Any truth to that?" I stared at him flatly. "Aggressive? No. I told them they were trespassing, and I wouldn't let them in without a court order. If that's aggressive, well, guess I'm guilty." The lead officer sighed. "Sounds like a civil dispute, but we're obligated to respond to every 911 call." He handed back my documents. "Far as I can tell, you're in the clear." And right on cue, Claire's SUV appeared at the bend, tires crunching loudly as she drove up behind the cruisers. She climbed out, her face flushed, her mouth already forming an indignant scowl. "Officers!" she called, marching toward us. "Why haven't you removed him? This land is under HOA jurisdiction. He's squatting on our community land." The officers exchanged looks. The lead officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, we've reviewed his ownership documents. Everything checks out." Claire's lips thinned. "He forged them. He's lying. I have our HOA expansion documents." "Ma'am," the officer interrupted, his patience thinning, "the HOA doesn't have authority to redraw county boundaries. Unless you've got a court order or county documentation, this isn't your jurisdiction." Claire's face turned a blotchy shade of red. "But I'm the president. I can—" "Ma'am, if you keep making false reports, we'll have to cite you for misuse of emergency services," the officer warned. For a split second, Claire looked stunned, as if the possibility had never occurred to her. Then her expression hardened again. "You'll regret this," she spat at me, before spinning on her heel and storming back to her SUV. I watched her drive away, tires spitting gravel in frustration, before turning back to the officers. The lead officer offered a tired smile. "Good luck, Mr. Cameron. Looks like you're gonna need it." As they left, I stood alone by the gate, heart pounding, adrenaline wearing off. I thought I'd seen the worst of it, but somehow I knew this wasn't over. Claire wasn't finished, not by a long shot. I didn't have to wait long for the next move. It came 2 days later, when I drove back up to the cabin after a supply run into town. As I turned off the main road onto the gravel path leading to my property, something immediately felt off. There was a strange obstruction ahead, something that hadn't been there before. As I crested the hill, my heart sank. Someone had erected a fence across the access road, right at the midpoint between the public road and my gate. It wasn't just any fence, either. It was a freshly installed wooden barrier, complete with a padlocked gate and a large metal sign bolted to the front. "Welcome to Pine Valley Estates. Private community property. No trespassing." I slammed the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the gravel. I climbed out, jaw clenched, and walked up to the fence. It stretched across the entire width of the road, anchored into the ground with concrete posts. There was no mistaking it. Someone had deliberately tried to block me from reaching my own home. I rattled the gate, locked tight. My pulse quickened as I scanned the surrounding area. Tracks from heavy equipment led off into the woods, the soil still freshly disturbed. I followed them cautiously, weaving between trees, until I spotted more signs nailed to the trunks. Community Access Trail, Pine Valley Estates, members only. Small flags marked a winding path that veered dangerously close to my property line. When I circled back to the cabin, a fresh wave of anger washed over me. The porch light had been knocked loose, swinging by a frayed wire. A set of muddy boot prints trailed across the front steps. Worse yet, when I checked the windows, I noticed subtle scratches around the frames. Someone had tried to pry one open. I stood still for a moment, fists clenched at my sides, staring out at the tree line. It wasn't enough for Claire to claim my land on paper. Now they were physically pushing in, inch by inch. I grabbed my phone and called Deputy Harris, the officer who'd responded last time. "You need to get up here," I told him. "Someone's trespassing. They built a fence across my access road. Looks like they tried breaking into the cabin, too." "I'll send a unit," Harris promised. While I waited, I took photos of everything. The fence, the signs, the tire tracks, the scratches. I emailed them straight to my lawyer with a simple message. They escalated. When the sheriff's deputies arrived an hour later, they walked the perimeter with me, taking their own photos and notes. One of them whistled low as he examined the fence. "This wasn't thrown up overnight," he said. "Looks like they had a crew out here." "Can they do this?" I asked, my voice tight. "Not legally," Harris replied. "Not unless they have a court order or some easement claim, which I doubt." He rubbed his chin. "I'll file a report, but you're gonna need a surveyor and your lawyer on this fast. They're trying to create facts on the ground." I exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling in my chest. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. By the time the deputies left, the sun was dipping below the ridge, casting long shadows across the clearing. I stood alone beside the fence, the bold letters of their sign catching the last orange light of the day. They weren't backing down. Neither was I. The next morning, I woke to the sound of chainsaws. For a second, I thought I was dreaming, but as the mechanical roar drilled deeper into my ears, I scrambled out of bed, pulled on boots, and ran outside. The noise was coming from the lower edge of my property, near the old tree line that bordered the dirt access road. I grabbed my binoculars off the porch rail and scanned the area. There they were, 4 men in neon vests, hard hats, and steel-toed boots, cutting down trees along the path where Claire's so-called community access trail had been marked the day before. A 5th man stood nearby, supervising with a clipboard, his shirt emblazoned with Pine Valley Estates Development Committee. I stormed down the path toward them, heart pounding. "Hey!" I shouted over the engines. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The supervisor turned lazily toward me, lowering his clipboard. "Clearing the easement," he said matter-of-factly. "Pine Valley's creating a pedestrian pathway. Should have gotten the notice in the mail." I stopped a few yards short, fists clenched. "There's no easement here. This is private property. You're trespassing." He shrugged. "Take it up with the HOA, buddy. We're just following orders." I stared at the felled trees, branches splayed across the ground like broken limbs. It wasn't just a trail. They were carving a road, a deliberate incursion deeper onto my land. My land. "You're not cutting down another damn tree," I growled. "Pack it up, now." One of the workers killed his chainsaw. Another hesitated, looking uncertain. The supervisor frowned. "Look, we don't want trouble, but we've got permits from the HOA." "Your HOA doesn't have authority here," I snapped. "You're trespassing and destroying private property. I've already got law enforcement involved. Next call I make is to the sheriff, and you'll all be leaving in handcuffs." That seemed to give them pause. After a tense silence, the supervisor cursed under his breath and signaled the crew. "Let's pull back," he muttered. "We'll let the lawyers figure it out." I watched as they loaded their equipment into a utility truck and drove off, leaving a trail of torn earth and fallen stumps behind them. My hands trembled with adrenaline as I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything: photos, videos, GPS coordinates. But the worst was yet to come. Later that afternoon, as I hammered boards over the window someone had tried to pry open, I heard tires crunching on gravel. I turned to see Claire's SUV parked halfway up the drive, her two officers standing beside it like bouncers outside a club. Claire stepped forward, arms folded, eyes glittering with smug triumph. "Quite the mess you've made for yourself, Nick," she said sweetly. "We tried to do this the easy way, but you've left us no choice." I wiped sweat from my brow, glaring at her. "You're out of your mind if you think you can bully me off my own land." "This isn't your land anymore," she replied coolly. "You're holding up community development. The boards voted to reclaim it. You'll be receiving formal notice soon." I let out a bitter laugh. "The board doesn't outrank the county recorder's office, or the law." Claire smirked. "We'll see. The paperwork's already in process. Once the county approves the adjustment, it's over for you. You might as well pack up now." One of the men stepped closer, cracking his knuckles. "Don't make this harder, Cameron. It's not worth it." I pulled my phone from my pocket and casually pointed it at them. "Smile for the camera." Claire's expression tightened. "Recording us won't stop what's coming." "No," I said quietly, "but it'll make sure you don't bury the truth." Her smile faltered, just for a moment. Then she waved her men back to the SUV. "Enjoy your last days up here, Nick. We'll be back." As their vehicle disappeared down the road, I stood alone on the porch, watching the sun dip low over the treetops, shadows creeping toward the cabin like dark fingers. For the first time since inheriting this place, I wasn't sure I'd be able to protect it. But one thing was certain: I wasn't giving up without a fight. The following days blurred into a frantic, relentless scramble. I spent every waking hour gathering evidence, forwarding photos and video footage to my lawyer, Rebecca Hayes. She was a sharp, no-nonsense attorney from Asheville who specialized in property disputes. And from the moment I told her what had been happening, she'd been laser-focused. "You're not dealing with a petty HOA power trip, Nick," she warned me over the phone. "They're orchestrating a land grab. I've seen this before. But this time, they've crossed legal lines." By midweek, Rebecca had filed an emergency injunction to halt any further development activities on my land. We served notice to Pine Valley Estates, along with a cease and desist order citing trespass, property damage, and attempted unlawful occupation. But even with legal action underway, the HOA wasn't slowing down. "They think they're untouchable," Rebecca muttered during one of our strategy calls. "We're going to change that." It didn't take long before her team uncovered something bigger. Hidden among county filings was a suspiciously recent boundary adjustment request, signed and submitted by Claire Mills herself. It falsely claimed that my grandfather had agreed to annex the property into Pine Valley Estates decades ago, citing a verbal agreement never documented in writing. Attached was a forged letter, allegedly from my grandfather, dated 1983, transferring rights to the HOA's predecessor organization. Rebecca emailed me a scan of the document. "See that signature?" she wrote. "Not even close to matching his other records. And the letterhead? It didn't exist until 1997. I stared at the screen, fury knotting my stomach. Claire hadn't just overstepped, she'd fabricated history. Rebecca immediately looped in the district attorney, forwarding copies of the forged documents along with an affidavit from the county recorder confirming no valid transfers had ever occurred. Within 48 hours, an investigation was formally opened. The breakthrough came when investigators subpoenaed Pine Valley's internal records. What they found blew the lid off everything. Claire had already signed a contract with a real estate development firm to sell her expanded parcel, my land included, for a new luxury subdivision. Even worse, she'd accepted a $500,000 advance, quietly funneled into a personal account under a shell company linked directly to her name. I got the call from Rebecca late that evening. "She sold your land, Nick. Or tried to. Fraudulently." The weight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. "So she was never going to stop," I muttered. "No," Rebecca confirmed. "She wasn't. But now she's facing felony charges." The next morning, I sat on the porch sipping bitter coffee, watching the clouds drift over the peaks, when two sheriff's cruisers pulled up the drive. Claire's black SUV wasn't far behind, but this time she wasn't the one calling the shots. Deputies stepped forward as Claire climbed out, confusion flashing across her face. "Officers?" she asked. "What's going on?" "Claire Mills," the lead deputy announced, pulling out handcuffs. "You're under arrest for fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit theft, and filing false legal documents." "What?" Her voice pitched up an octave. "You can't be serious!" One deputy read her rights as they guided her to the patrol car. Claire's two officers stood frozen beside the SUV, mouths slack as they watched their leader taken away. I leaned against the porch rail, arms folded, meeting Claire's stunned gaze as they shut the cruiser door. Her expression was a mix of outrage and disbelief. "Guess that board vote didn't work out after all," I said quietly. The deputy climbed into the driver's seat, and the cars rolled down the gravel road, kicking up dust until they vanished from sight. For the first time in weeks, the air felt still again. But I knew the fight wasn't quite over. Not until the courts made it official. Still, as I stood there, I allowed myself a rare small smile. We'd turned the tide. The trial started 3 months later, but it felt like I'd been waiting a lifetime for that day. I sat at the plaintiff's table next to Rebecca in a packed courtroom, my hands folded tight in my lap. Across the aisle, Claire sat flanked by her lawyer, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, though she still held her chin high, as if sheer arrogance might save her from the law. Her so-called officers were seated behind her, avoiding eye contact, their bravado from those mountain visits long gone. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense tone, called the court to order. What followed was a meticulous unraveling of every lie Claire had spun. Rebecca presented our case like a surgeon wielding a scalpel, clean, precise, undeniable. First came the deeds and historical records proving my family's uninterrupted ownership since 1958. Then the county surveyor testified, confirming the property lines had never legally changed. The forged letter from 1983, a handwriting expert testified that it wasn't even close to my grandfather's signature, and the county clerk swore under oath that no such document had ever been filed. But the biggest blow came when the prosecution unveiled the financial trail. Bank statements tracing the $500,000 deposit straight to Claire's shell company, along with emails between her and the development firm outlining plans to fast-track annexation through fabricated documents. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer strike, chipping away at any defense her lawyer tried to mount. Claire sat stiffly as the prosecution played footage from my security cameras, her standing at my gate, her men cutting down trees, her smirking while threatening me on my own porch. Watching her squirm as the recordings filled the courtroom, speakers was more satisfying than I'd imagined. Her lawyer's cross-examination amounted to little more than feeble protests about misunderstandings and good faith efforts. But even the jury looked unconvinced, exchanging glances that said everything. When the closing arguments ended, the judge called for a recess. I stepped outside into the cool mountain air, letting my breath fog in front of me, staring up at the sky. Rebecca joined me, tucking a file under her arm. "You've already won, Nick," she said quietly. "Now, we're just waiting for the paperwork." An hour later, we filed back into the courtroom. The judge's voice was firm and clear as he read the verdict. Claire Mills, guilty on all counts of fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and attempted theft. The civil judgment awarded me full ownership, free and clear, plus $350,000 in damages to cover legal fees, property repairs, and emotional distress. I barely heard the rest. Relief washed over me in a wave so powerful I had to grip the table to steady myself. Across the aisle, Claire's mask of composure cracked, her lips trembling as deputies approached to escort her out. Rebecca leaned closer, voice low. 4 years in state prison. That's what they're recommending. I exhaled slowly. Good. As Claire was led away in cuffs, she turned one last time, her expression a volatile mix of bitterness and disbelief. I met her stare without blinking. For once, she had nothing left to say. Reporters swarmed the hallway as we stepped outside, microphones flashing, cameras snapping. "Mr. Cameron, how do you feel about the verdict?" one called. I paused at the courthouse steps, gazing out toward the horizon, the mountains rising steady and strong beyond the city skyline. "Vindicated," I replied simply. Rebecca smiled beside me. "Let's go home, Nick." And for the first time in months, I knew exactly where home was, and that it was finally mine again. The first thing I did after the verdict was call the fencing company. A week later, a crew arrived with steel posts, reinforced gates, and a truckload of security equipment. I stood by the porch as they unloaded panels of iron fencing, watching them work with a quiet satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. By the end of the day, my property was surrounded by a sturdy, 6-foot-high perimeter fence topped with discreet security cameras, each one feeding live footage straight to my phone. At the entrance, I installed a heavy metal gate with a bold sign welded into the bars. "Private property. HOA not welcome." I wasn't taking chances anymore. As I watched the last worker tighten the bolts, a sense of finality settled over me. For too long, Claire and her cronies had pushed, encroached, threatened. Now, every inch of this land was mine, and secured against anyone who thought otherwise. That evening, I invited Rebecca and a few close friends up to the cabin. We grilled steaks on the porch as the sun sank behind the mountains, casting golden light over the treetops. Laughter carried into the crisp night air, mingling with the crackle of the fire pit. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. Rebecca raised a glass toward me. "To standing your ground," she toasted, "and to not letting the bastards win." We clinked glasses, and I leaned back in my chair, gazing up at the stars. The cabin had always felt like an escape, but tonight, it felt like a triumph. Over the next few weeks, the ripple effects of the trial spread through Pine Valley Estates. Word got out about the fraud, the attempted land grab, Claire's conviction. Residents started questioning other HOA policies, digging through financial records, holding emergency meetings. Rebecca forwarded me articles from local papers, headlines calling it the HOA Scandal of the Year. Some board members resigned. A petition circulated to dissolve the entire association. 12 neighbors, inspired by my case, filed their own complaints against Pine Valley. Claims of improper fines, unauthorized liens, shady bookkeeping. It was like a dam had broken. I didn't set out to bring down their kingdom, but I wasn't sad to see it crumble. One afternoon, I got a letter in the mail, an official notice from the county. Pine Valley Estates had formally relinquished any claim over my land. Final and irrevocable, it read. I pinned it above the fireplace, right next to my grandfather's old photograph. He'd fought to keep this land free. I'd carried that fight forward. And as I stood outside the gate that evening, watching the sun dip low behind the ridges, I felt something settle inside me. A quiet, steady peace. Not the fragile kind I'd known before the battle, but the hard-won calm that comes after you've defended what's yours. A hawk soared overhead, circling high above the pines. Somewhere down the valley, the faint sound of a distant engine drifted up, but it didn't bother me. My land. My rules. The cabin's porch light flickered on as dusk deepened, casting a warm glow over the yard. I smiled, turned toward the door, and walked inside, knowing that for the first time in a long time, I could finally call this place safe. And mine. Forever.